Welcome to the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show. I think this is
issue 63.
Steve.
Boom.
Hey everyone, welcome to Pop XP. And before the show starts, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload awesome new content. And don't forget, if you can, make sure to share our stream on all your social media outlets. We appreciate it, and thanks for helping us grow the Pop XP channel.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show, issue 64. I see that little smirk on your face, Steve. What's going on over there?
Well, I saw you do that little drum thing, and I was like, "Was he?"
I'm listening to the beat. I'm listening to the song.
I was like, "Do you think he is Phil Collins?"
Phil Collins. Oh, come on. Okay. Anyways, now get us through this. We got a lot going on today, but now we got to get the important stuff out of the way.
Yes. Let's get to the important stuff. Everyone, look below, click that subscribe button, and smash that bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome new content like tonight's episode. And gentlemen, I'm ready to dive into this. It's not a miniature episode; it's a large episode. So let's get to it, fellas.
Okay, this episode we got a special guest, and it parlays with almost Dan Hedstrom. Remember when we brought in Road Warrior Hawk? It was a little sidestep from comics, but it had to do with comics, with wrestling, Hawk, and a lot of the bodybuilding stuff we did. Now this is also a little sidestep, and Steve, I asked Steve for permission. He granted me that gift. He opened the Rainbow Bridge to me, and I said, I want to do something that also pertains to comics. Yeah, Niles like me, we just go with the flow. Steve's the boss behind all this stuff. He can get vicious. He can get vicious. Say. Yeah, he gets mad. He pouts a lot too. My God, but why I like this is Steve likes to be educated. We know Steve is the smart guy, the historian, all that, the big overstreet guy. Yeah, we know all that, but sometimes Steve likes to be educated, and he wasn't a big fan of this, or you didn't really know. So we're going to be talking about first, before we get into our guest and what he's going to be representing. We got to have a little backstory. So Steve, first off, what did you know about Dungeons and Dragons?
Again, that was something that wasn't very big in England, of course. I saw it via pop culture movies and some references to it. But generally speaking, it did not exist in England as far as I knew. It's pure Americana. So that's the only thing that I knew. I knew it was some sort of board game, and that was the height of my knowledge regarding it.
Well, it was actually a board game of the mind. That's what made it so interesting. But let's go back a little bit. What actually predates Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I'm not no expert, but it was actually miniature wargaming. During the 40s, 50s, and 60s, like people, World War II was abound, but what happened is they were all these like miniature soldiers that these adults actually played on these vast landscapes. You had like Napoleon's army, the French, and they had this huge. That was big in wasn't it?
No. If you're talking about the lead soldiers and the metal soldiers, massive, hardcore. And you had rules and regulations. You had a dice. There was certain firepower.
Yes.
Okay? Yes. That was for the haughty-taughty, very rich kids, because only rich kids could afford lead toys. Okay. And some of them kids even had painted, fully painted armies. I had the plastic ones, okay, because I was living outside the back of trash cans. But so I had the plastic ones, I'm fully aware of playing with soldiers and toys, but I am, so I'm sort of grounded there with you.
Oh, so look, wait, this has something to do with Steve too. But Niall can tell you something too, because me and Niall discovered today. Niall, who was a big time celebrity actor that was huge into this. What? Go ahead. Who was it?
Great, you put me on the spot and I can't remember his name.
You disappoint me, my friend.
Oh, come
But
on.
he's
We'll think
great
of Star
from
Wars.
Star Wars.
Yes. Peter Cushing. He was huge into the wargaming, and he used to collect them. There was something about those metal miniatures that especially from where you were from, Steve, like, my God, that was huge. But in 1971, Gary Gygax, and I think his name was Jeff Perrin, they kind of took that idea. In 1971, they made this game called Chainmail, and it had a little to do with now, if I might not be 100% correct, but what they did is there were these little books, and it was almost taking those miniature gamings, like the Crusades or whatever those soldiers was, and they made like these booklets that you could actually play. I guess they were like more revised rules, and they added, like, it was something kind of like that, but they still used these metal miniatures in a different way. But then in 1974, Gary Gygax and his name was Dave Arnson, they formed TSR, and which came Dungeons and Dragons. And as you know, in 1974, you got what predated that? Already starting that buzz, you had the Conan paperbacks, obviously Robert E. Howard. You had the Conan paperbacks, you had the Frazetta covers and all that stuff. And in 1971, our hero, you had Conan starting to hit the scene. So with that starting to come into fruition, this Dungeons and Dragons had it had more of an imagination, and they started putting more of, instead of the medieval stuff, they started doing more fantasy. So that's when, like I said, Conan, and this has proved true for a few things when they did TSR. Now, the reason why this is so big to me, in the late 70s and early 80s, I started getting into that because, being into comics and all that stuff was crazy. I loved it so much, but Dungeons and Dragons was a little offshoot of it. But what really got me into Dungeons and Dragons was first, particularly, this book right here, The Deity and Demigods. This came out in 1980. But why this is so important was because it had the Greek mythos, it had the Norse mythos, it had this one actually had the Elric, and it had the Cthulhu mythos. But why this was so huge is that it had it had Thor and Hercules. So I used to be on the playground, and we used to be like, oh my God, people were into D&D, but they had the stats for Hercules and they had the stats for Thor. Now they were like the real guys, but us thinking of the comics and all that stuff. And if we go, I didn't know about this till a few years later, but this one actually predated it. It's called the Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. This one came out in 1976. And why this is so important is this is when Dungeons and Dragons is starting to move in there. They haven't been aboard, they haven't had the hit they were yet, but this came out in 1979. I think they had 4 or 5 books. Could be wrong on that, don't kill me. But why this is so important, and this came out in 76, they also even have the Robert E. Howard. They have Conan's stats in there too, because what was probably the biggest comic book in the world at that time, like I said, was Conan. So that was in the ether. So, everybody was collecting Conan. Conan was a big deal, especially, you had Savage Sword of Conan and stuff. So you could see they got those ideas, obviously from, Robert E. Howard and all that stuff. But I always believed Roy Thomas had a little piece of that, because now the comics are taking place, and Conan was huge, especially in the mid 70s to the late 70s. But anyways, we started playing this stuff, and we like I said, I would even get if you see, this was the second volume, you got Hercules there. And like I said, Steve, it was the closest thing to comic books. And I started getting so into the Dungeons and Dragons because I was collecting it. Dungeons and Dragons actually, it parlayed into things like, case in point, check this out. In the early 80s, They actually made a Conan. You know, we got. I think they're using US body in there, Steve, to replace Arnold, if I'm correct. And then we got the other one right here. But here's a very interesting one too, Steve. I think you want to know this. Roy signed them all for me, but look at that. They actually made a Red Sonja one in 1985.
Oh, cool. Wow.
And this is a tougher one to get. And and Roy knew about all these stuff too. So you could see how the superheroes and all that stuff were kind of forming, you know, D&D was getting big, TSR, so they started licensing. And this was one of the games that changed my life. My God, you could actually get stats for the superheroes, and there was like a class 1000. They had the Celestials. This was crazy, Steve, because you know, to actually see stats, this kind of took the Marvel the Marvel Universe guides a step further, because you could read about it, but you could actually play with them in this game. This was huge to me. And as we were talking about those metal miniatures and all that gaming, that stuff still stayed with D&D. And I got a few here that you're going to be interested in, that I have a huge, crazy collection of this. They made Conans. And look at that. Who's this? I mean, right there, Steve. Who's the artist on there? Can you see?
Is that John Buscema, right?
No, it's actually Ernie Chan on this one right here.
Okay.
Yeah. Ernie Chan did that. But I'm just saying, the Conan ones, and then these kind of changed my life. Check these out, Steve. You had the Marvel superheroes metal miniatures. My God. And this was crazy too. You actually had the third set. You had Ultron. But I was so crazy about these metal miniatures that we used to go to the comic store, and then down the street were hobby shops. I don't know if you remember back in the 80s, like in the early to mid 80s, because with the Dungeons and Dragons explosion, hobby shops blew up all over the country. So I would get the comics, and I would also go to the hobby shop and see if I could get you know, some of the metal miniatures, and you could find them. But here's one that's going to make you love it, though, Steve. Look at that, Steve. Who's that? That's you, Steve. Look, there it is. That's nice. My Stevie. That's my Stevie. and look, if we want to have Niall, here you go, Niall. There's you. Who's that? Who's that?
Captain America.
Captain America, yes. So we had all that stuff. And here's me right here, because I want to rule the world someday. That's Dr. Doom.
There you go.
Now,
where's the Hulk?
The Hulk. It's actually in my sealed one.
Oh.
But I do have. They used to make a lot of bootlegs. I actually have this one from Castle Creations. That's a Lou Ferrigno Hulk. Look at the arms on that, Steve. Woo! So anyways, it was the metal miniatures that got me crazy, and I loved, for some reason, I love that. Now, this is going to pertain to the guest we have today. They were huge. Metal miniatures were huge, especially in the 70s and 80s, and the biggest company was Ral Partha. That was the biggest company. There was a lot of other ones, but Ral Partha was the biggest. When I started talking to this guy, he was a big Roy fan. He loved the All-Star Squadron and all that stuff, but I would sometimes order, now that, you know, I got some money, I would order sometimes things that I wanted when I was a kid, metal miniatures and all that stuff that I could get. And I go online, and I looked up that there was this company. This company was called Ral Partha Legacy. And what was great about it is that they had some of the molds of all the older stuff. And so I wanted to call up. So I call up, and it's the guy I was talking to before. Then I'm like, this is you? And I was like, I couldn't believe he ran the company. And I said, you know what? These metal miniatures mean a lot to me, and the whole history of them. It's such a niche audience, but they're like me. They're rabid for this stuff. And for some reason, I don't know why I'm crazy about these metal miniatures, but I am. And we brought him right straight to you, and he's going to give us the history of this stuff, background, and all the stuff that he has. Let's bring him out right now. Jacob Fathbruckner of Ral Partha Legacy Ltd. Here he comes.
Hi.
Jacob, first off, thank you for coming on. Once again, I wanted this interview because what you do, I think, is fascinating, and you are a historian on this stuff, and we're a niche market that love this stuff and that we're crazy about it. But, you know, not many people know about it. They just probably know, or they know of, and like, oh yeah, that's cool. But in today's metal, they're not even metal. They're all this plastic stuff. But you have become the name in this industry with this stuff. And when I found out that you ran Ral Partha Legacy and all that stuff, tell us the history of this first. I know I got maybe a lot of stuff wrong, but give us some of the history of these metal miniatures and then how you got into what you're doing, and then we can go forward.
Sure. I'll do my best here, and I'll try not to ramble too much. And really, the whole thing isn't really about me at all. But I'm willing to play advocate for all the people that it really is about. So yeah, as you had said, toy soldiers have been around as long as people have been melting down metal. And yeah, in 71, Gygax and Perrin, I think it was, did chainmail, which, and I would say, not to take anything away from that, there were plenty of people who had done rule sets before that, but not necessarily published as successfully. I know, well, H.G. Wells actually did a set of rules called Little Wars, which is, probably very popular at the time, comparatively. But the thing that, TSR really did with chainmail was commercializing it successfully. So it was able to get what was something that maybe just only spread among friends, these rule sets, and they got one that then all of a sudden stretched, at least across the United States, if not different parts of the world. And, there were as early as 1970, there were in Cincinnati, different people meeting up different nights of the week. Certain gamers would have everybody over to their house, like in the Cincinnati area, a group of friends. So, like 10 to 20 people or so. And some guys specialized in board games and some in Avalon Hill games, which were sort of a prototype. And of course, chainmail, which was more complicated, and eventually D&D. And that's how the Ral Partha guys got to know each other. They weren't the start of it, though, obviously. There was, in the 70s, you had a company called Minifigs that set up in New York, upstate New York. They had started in the UK, actually, and they were licensing the miniatures to produce in the US. There were a bunch of major companies at the time that were located in England, Greenwood and Ball. Some of the other names escape me at the moment, but most of them are not directly in production. A lot of them have been brought back from time to time by other small companies. But the quality wasn't really notable at the time from an artistic point of view. They were neat, but not as intricate as they would become. And in the early 70s, a guy up in Dayton named Duke Seafried started a miniatures company that went by a couple different names, but is generally known as Custom Cast. One of his partners in that was down at one of these events in Cincinnati, happened to make a comment to this, I think, 14-year-old kid who had converted some of his own pieces, jokingly saying, "Hey, do you want a job?" And that kid basically went home, bought some stuff to sculpt in, and eventually became the guy we know as Tom Meyer, who is probably one of the most prolific miniature sculptors in the world. And he ended up actually going back over. He got invited to go over to the UK, stayed with one of the more prominent companies there for a while, lived in like the one guy's guest house, I think. And there was a lot of collaboration back and forth techniques as far as sculpting and then casting production. Where was I going with this? So there have been a lot of people involved. Also out in Pennsylvania, you had Grenadier started up right about the same time. I think they were in 75. And even though D&D did play a large role in this, like at Grenadier, they started with historicals miniatures. And I think all the Ral Partha owners, except for maybe one, were historicals players. That was probably their biggest thing when they started the company. But over time, their initial releases were fantasy releases, about a dozen of them, set in Middle Earth. And then they went and did some historicals because that's what everybody was doing. And over time, they found that the fantasy stuff outsold the historicals. So they naturally went in that direction more and more. But yeah, there's a lot of different companies and a lot of sculptors and individuals who sort of move back and forth from one company to another.
Yeah, it was a lot like the comic writers. It's funny because when I started reading up on it, like you notice one guy would work for one company and then he would go to the other company and then he would do and then they would swap like ideas and all that stuff too, because it was kind of like the Wild West, basically a lot like the comics were. You go to DC.
Well, yeah, just like in the I think it was the 40s, you had like it was either Otto or Jack Binder was writing for multiple companies and using pseudonyms, and then I think that's why the name Jay Gavin exists, also, isn't it? Because
which one?
Jay Gavin.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wanting to say that was Don Heck, but that can't be right.
Oh, wait.
X-Men artist around 67, 68 maybe.
Yeah.
But I think he was working for multiple companies. And you had that with the sculptors in the miniatures industry too. If a sculptor was considered on staff, meaning they got a salary on top of like royalties, the company owners usually were not real happy if they found out you were sculpting for their competitors.
Yeah, it was. Once again, it was real interesting because, like, when I was getting into Dungeons and Dragons, with the comic books and all that stuff, and like I said, the reason why I got into them wasn't really for the Dungeons and Dragons. It was for like the deity and demigods, because I could see I never saw anything like that because I'm a OCD and like I love stats and when you could do it, but then you could play with these figures, and I never thought, I don't know what it was, but I never thought you were supposed to move that. I just thought they represented you, and I used to. Steve, I know this is going to drive Steve crazy, but I'm going to tell you, when I used to look through the comic boxes and then I would go to the hobby store, I would look, because they used to have racks. You remember that, Jacob? Racks and racks and racks of these figures. And I would just like look through them like, oh my God. And I don't know, it was just something about them that like, they just fascinated me. And then going on this community, I started realizing there's like a rabid fan base. Like I said, although niche, it was rabid. And like Steve, what is so funny is like, Jacob, you'll attest to this. When we talk about a figure, we also talk about the code. Like the Lord Soth 11-064 Ral Partha. It's the same thing as you can say for your comic books. I know Steve loves the Silver Surfer #4. That's his holy Bible. But how you can say an issue like that, that's how it is. And you got to think, how many thousands of these metal miniatures are there? Jacob, you can attest to that. Like, go ahead.
Sure.
And
at Ral Partha, there were safely, I'd say, 6,000 figures they put into production.
Wow.
over a 30-year period. And then so the company in 96 to 98, somewhere in there, the original owners sold actually to FASA, which they were a rules company that hung around for a little bit longer before they transformed on, and they shifted focus of the company. And then it actually changed hands into some of the former Ral Partha employees were able to essentially trade in their retirement and their pensions, I guess it was, to get ownership of the equipment of Ral Partha, which at this point was, several years older again. And FASA hadn't had a lot of success with it. So then that became Ironwind Metals, which from 2001 up till today is still running and producing a lot of the Ral Partha stuff, but focused probably more on the Battletech, and they do a lot of contract casting also. They do have a couple hundred of the fantasy pieces in production, but for the most part, it was whatever was in production back when they took over from FASA, aside from a few points where they, pick a dozen or two figures and put them into production, which, takes a lot of work. And if you don't have a good distributor system set up, it's a lot of money to put down ahead of time.
Yeah. nowadays people are doing the 3D printing. I see that. I don't know if you guys have seen that. They'll design like a figure, because it's all bootleg now. Like, and then they use these, and they'll actually sell them. And then they use this like plastic machine that basically makes these little metal miniatures, but they're like a harder plastic. But they'll get artists and all that to it. For me, it's no comparison to these metal miniatures. Now, first off, Steve or Niall, you got anything to ask Jacob? Because I can go all night with this guy.
So obviously, when you watch a show like Stranger Things, and they have the game that they're playing, which is obviously Dungeons and Dragons without saying it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, what is the peak era of Dungeons and Dragons?
Well, that's probably going to be, again, based on who you ask. The company that produced it, TSR, had several different eras of ownership. So and Ral Partha went through the same thing. Probably most small companies do, which is you have your peaks and your valleys. Notable peaks, though, would be in the very late 70s, early 80s. When TSR Dungeons and Dragons was really growing fast, and it sort of had its first big swipe across the country, right? And I think Grenadier was the company that was producing those, and that had started as a two-man team out of Pennsylvania. And when they got the Dungeons and Dragons license, their sales went through the roof. But they also lost some control over things, because you're dealing with this company that can sort of, pull your strings a little bit, saying, well, we want you to do this or that. And usually in those kind of things, eventually the contracts always sour, probably due to personalities and just, death by 1,000 cuts, right? So at some point around like 84-ish, and I've got some information that's like sort of the backroom dealings of what happened on some of these things that people don't know about. So it's going to be hard to tell if I'm just making it up or if it's the truth. But I'll give you the best I've got. And essentially, there's an accusation that TSR tried to buy out the primary sculptor and co-owner of Grenadier. And he sort of did an end run around them to keep that from happening. But in the end, they lost the Grenadier. They lost the Dungeons and Dragons contract. Now, Grenadier went on and stayed in business another 20 years. But there's a lot of that sort of stuff that happens behind the scenes where they're trying to influence each other. And the contracts were looser back in the 70s and 80s too, especially the early 80s. And so like Grenadier just rebranded all their Dungeons and Dragons stuff as generic fantasy and kept selling the exact same miniatures. By the time Dungeons and Dragons got involved with Ral Partha, and allegedly back in the late 70s, right before Dungeons and Dragons hit, well, it was out, but it hadn't hit big. There's a story that the president at the time of Ral Partha, all the co-owners of Ral Partha knew Gary Gygax. I guess pretty much everybody who was going to the convention scene, they all knew each other fairly well. But I guess the guy who was president of Ral Partha said something pretty insulting to Gygax. And essentially from that point on, Gygax had decided he'd never do business with Ral Partha. Well, through internal stuff, Gygax ended up losing control of the company sometime between like 83 and 86.
Yeah.
And under the new leadership, they went to the company that was seen as having the best quality and, arguably the biggest sales, although I think it's really hard to test sales in the mid 80s. But ballpark, Ral Partha was allegedly the number one company. I'm pretty sure the guys who were in charge of Grenadier would have disputed that. But they were selling on 7 continents. It's allegedly thanks to actually getting into the PXs at military bases at one point, which is probably how they were able to claim the 7th continent, I would say.
Yeah, you got to admit, to produce these things, they were selling millions of them. And the funny thing is, before we get into how you became with Ral Partha Legacy, when Wizards of the Coast bought out TSR, there's an interesting story there. Like, what I love about this, the little backdoor stuff, like tell the little story about what happened to Ral Partha and all this stuff. I love this shit.
So, so Ral Partha was started by 6 friends, gaming friends. So, and it's kind of like having comic book friends. You're friends, but you're not all best friends, you know, different personalities and stuff. So it was started in 75 by these 6 guys. By 1996, one of them was gone, and several of the others were not talking to each other that much anymore. And basically, they decided that, you know, as the market was changing, they were now in their 40s, maybe even late 40s, starting to look at things like, well, hey, am I going to be able to have health insurance 10 years from now? Stuff like that. And the original owners decided that they just wanted out. And they, going off the top of my head here, so around that same time period, as these negotiations were happening, probably 94, 95, you know, TSR sells to Wizards of the Coast. And Wizards of the Coast is the company that came up with the Magic cards, Magic the Gathering.
That was huge. Huge.
Yeah. And TSR basically got caught in a money crunch, and they had bills due and didn't have the money to pay immediately, and they couldn't get a loan. Probably a position that I think they had been in several times before. I think Ral Partha had probably been in several times before. I'm sure Grenadier had too. It's just everybody who's running everything on a shoestring budget. And, you know, that ended up taking them down, and Wizards of the Coast bought them. Wizards of the Coast, though, just looked at things, and they decided that they wanted to go into their own production of miniatures as opposed to licensing through Ral Partha. And unfortunately, the contract that Ral Partha had to sign in around 1986, 87, TSR had learned its lesson from Grenadier, and there was specific language saying you can't relabel these miniatures and use them if you use our likenesses, because a lot of the miniatures in those ranges were based, not all of them, but a lot of them were based off artwork that was used in D&D promotional materials or books or packaging or something. So when Wizards of the Coast decided they wanted to do their own production, they informed Ral Partha, and there was a run-out period there where they were allowed to keep selling but not produce anything new, really. And then TSR representatives, probably Wizards of the Coast employees, I would assume, actually came out to Cincinnati to witness the destruction of the production molds. So they wanted to make sure that there was no chance of them coming back. So they literally went out and watched as I think what they ended up doing, there's stories that they burnt them, but I've never heard that from anybody that was there. I think what they probably did, because a rubber mold's a hard thing to destroy. You can mess it up, but, you know, cutting it in half takes some effort. What they did was took half of each mold and threw them all in a dumpster, and then 2 weeks later threw the other half in another dumpster.
Yeah, just to clarify, just so you know, like when they make the molds of these stuff, it's like a rubber. Jacob will tell us about this stuff in a little, he'll probably show us some of the stuff in a little bit. But what's interesting, Steve, what they did, even Ral Partha through the years, is they just would keep reprinting these things because they could keep doing that. So what Wizards of the Coast did, because they knew they would do that, they would destroy these molds so there would be no chance of ever reproducing them. But that's where little Jacob over here comes in, because he has some of these molds that were not destroyed and all that stuff. So tell about your history with getting into Ral Partha's legacy and starting a fascinating little job here and doing this, making this magic for me. Maybe not Steve, maybe even not Niall, but for me.
I got into miniatures in like 2001. I had quit my job as a McDonald's manager because I got pissed off. And a friend of mine had owned the local hobby store. He hadn't had a vacation in like 15 years. So he hired me to come in and run it for a couple months. And then after that, I ran it a few days a week for him. And during that time, we had what we referred to as the regulars come in. Those would be basically the younger customers who would come in and spend their whole day at the hobby store. And eventually they talked me into painting some miniatures, standard young guy stuff. They were like, oh, you don't want to do it because you suck at it. And then it's like, well, here, hand me one and I'll paint it. I got stuck into it that way, and was a part of that local community for a number of years. And eventually I started collecting older pieces because I found that they were more fun and there was something appealing about them. This is also when eBay was starting up pretty big, at least in my life. So all of a sudden I was able to track down miniatures from, my youth or before and pick them up. I ended up buying some secondhand miniatures from a guy who turned out to be one of the original Ral Partha owners, a guy named Rich Smethurst. He's still a good friend to this day. He still lived down in Cincinnati. And he told me we met at a show, at a small convention, maybe 100, 110 people. And he was telling me these stories about stuff that had happened, in 1975 about them, basically guys who were just hobbyists, and really a miniatures collector and a comic book collector are essentially the same person. It's really just a matter of how you've decided to spend your money. And there's a ton of crossover. So it was a community group I was already really familiar with. And my first unofficial jobs for several years was when I was like 13. I started out, sweeping floors and organizing stuff at the local comic book store. I got paid in pizza and back issues. Not good back issues, but back issues. And
must be a torpedo comic.
Yeah. So I got to know Rich, and these stories were they were funny and quirky, and it's like, guys almost burning themselves or setting a house on fire trying to, run this machinery in their basement. And I thought it was a pretty good story, and I had wanted to be a writer. I had given it up by that point and decided, hey, you know what, this story is worth writing down. And so I started driving down to Cincinnati. I'm north of Columbus, so I'm about 2.5 hours away. So it makes for a full day to drive down, spend several hours, and drive back. But I was doing that on a semi-regular basis, every other week or so, going down, spending a long weekend or something. And Rich started introducing me to people down there. So eventually I got to know the guy who was the president of Iron Wind Metals, Mike No. He had been the factory manager at Ral Partha, which essentially is the guy in charge of production from about 1987 to 2001. So he had been there through the original Ral Partha owners. When FASA bought it, FASA then transferred their ownership over to a company called WizKids, which was started by one of the FASA owners. And then Mike was like the lead guy when they handed it off. They basically told him, if you give up your pension and you find, I think, 5 other people to do the same, you guys can have the company. But by then they had stripped it of all the things that made it profitable, really. So I got to meet Mike. It was a busy, rainy night the night I came in. And he was trying to do like 10 things at once, which should have been a good warning to me about what I was getting into. But a really friendly guy and very generous with his time and his knowledge. I ended up being able to help him out with something that night. They were trying to find something in some old molds that were in storage. They were trying to find something for a customer that wanted to spend a decent amount of money to get copies of these things. And they had some some photo records of what's in some of the molds, but they didn't have any documentation to go with it. So they sent me down at a computer with a little zip drive with like thousands of pictures on it of these black rubber molds. So you had really bad photos of everything. And they said, see if you can find this. Well, I found it. And that sort of got me an invitation to come back and play around in the future. Am I rambling on this too much?
No.
Well, go ahead.
So I kept coming back, probably was every weekend for a while there. it eventually got to the point where they were letting me sleep in his office on Friday night, so I didn't have to drive back the same night. Sometimes I'd stay with Rich, and I was getting to know, through Rich, I was getting to know more of the people who had helped, build the company in the 70s, picking up more stories, jotting down notebooks worth of stories. Some are interesting, some aren't, but you want to hear them all in the end. And I got really involved with Iron Wind over time. I was younger and dumber. I was very arrogant. And on the first time meeting Mike, he walked me back and he showed me there's two types of molds. There's production molds, which is what, like, every miniature that John held up came out of a production mold. There's also master molds, which that's where the original piece that a sculptor makes goes into a mold. So from a master mold, you can put a bunch of different sculpts in one and get like 12 different sculpts to come back. And those are what you then use. You run that off several times, and then you make a production mold, which the production mold can throw back like 12 copies of the exact same figure. So it's sort of like, actually what I would attribute it to would be, with old comics, it would be the printer's plates that were used to say produce Fantastic Four #1. Even though we know the comic industry wasn't good about saving those at all. But it's the thing that you use to then make the pieces that you sell. And even though a lot of the production molds, they, by their very nature, you're pouring hot metal into them repeatedly and spinning them, they go bad over time. Iron Wind still had all the master molds going back to at least 1976. So all but like the first year of the company. And, the first time Mike showed me that, he's cracking these open and showing me figures that I know on eBay are selling for like $10 or $15 a piece. And he's got the master molds to him right here, and they're crisp and they're well taken care of. They've actually, everybody who's had hold of the company over the years always took care of these things because they knew they were what's important. And unfortunately, not all the companies that have existed over time have done that. A lot of them have been more short-sighted about it. And so I immediately that night, decided to tell this guy who'd been in the industry for 20, 30 years at that point, I had to tell him his business, right? So I said, you need to put these old things back into production. People would really like them. And he humored me and was very nice. And, I kept coming back, and every once in a while I would prod him and say, we should put these out, really should. And, over time, Mike taught me how to cast. He taught me the mold making process. How they price miniatures, how the relationships work. He was just very, very generous with his time and his knowledge. And not everybody is with either of those things. So I owe a lot to Mike No. And one of the original Ral Partha partners, man named Mark Rubin, had also bought in when Mike started up Iron Wind. So he was a minority partner, basically advising Mike on certain things, and they were friends. So I got to know Mark as well. And in 2014, I got foolishly talked into running for local office, and as a sacrificial lamb. I knew what I was getting into, but that basically took me away for a year. And so the first weekend of November of 2014, I was done with it. I'd spent a whole year campaigning locally, which is exhausting. It almost destroyed my marriage. And I decided, okay, I'm going to go down to Cincinnati, see Mike, rest, recuperate, talk miniatures with a bunch of guys. And went down and having dinner with Mike that Friday night. And I just threw it out there. I said, well, enough time has passed. What do you say we put out some of these old figures? And just, it shocked the hell out of me. But he said, oh, you know what? Write up a proposal, bring it back next weekend, and Mark and I will sit and you can propose it. And if you can talk us into it, then we'll do it. And I had a lot more energy and foolishness at the time. So I went home and spent the week basically writing up a proposal to put, I think it was 24 figures into production. and they wanted it done as a Kickstarter, which I hadn't even really heard of Kickstarter at the time. It existed, but I didn't know anything about it. So I did a lot of homework, made a lot of suppositions, wrote up 3 or 4 different proposals to bring down, and pitched it to these guys. I think in the middle of a snowstorm. I drove through a lot of bad weather during that time period, but I was more passionate than smart at the time. And somehow whatever I had pitched to them at first, they gave me notes. I went home, came back the next weekend with a revised version. We did that a couple times. At one point, I got stranded down there. A blizzard came through, and I got trapped at Mike's house. So that probably helped because he couldn't get away from me. But they ended up saying, okay, we'll put out these figures, but you have to run the project. And, once again, I was just excited to be involved. So I was like, sure. And the figures that we wanted to put out were so Tom Meyer was one of the original owners of Ral Partha, and arguably the best miniature sculptor in the world to this day. Definitely the most technically skilled of anyone. People can argue styles and design. You can't really argue the technical side of it that much. But the man can put, rivets on armor on a figure that's just 1 inch tall. And everybody I've talked to in the industry that has known him, most of them are still at least very respectful of his skills. Like with any artistic endeavor, peers are also competitors. So, there's praise, but nobody wants to praise too much, right?
So you have all these molds and stuff today, right? So you produce this stuff.
Yeah.
Can you show us some of that stuff? Yeah, that's the Death Dealer.
There you go.
That's cool.
So this was sculpted in 1975. Tom was literally 15 years old at the time.
Wow.
And this was, so compared to some of the stuff produced today, it might not be technically as perfect, but compared to what was produced in 1975, this is top notch. As Tim Kask, actually the editor on 1 or 2 of those books that you were holding up, John, has told me, back at the time, most metal miniatures, you had to paint the buttons and the epaulets onto them. And Tom actually sculpted all these pieces. And there were actually people who were known as like major painters within the hobby that were sort of offended at first or scared of painting these pieces, because before you'd paint the buttons and everything on, whereas with Tom, it actually existed, and then all of a sudden you had to make your paintbrush match what he's doing, which really did change up a lot of things for the hobby. But so this is a very old piece. Here's one from just a couple years later. Let's see. The light might not catch it quite right. So this is a pewter casting, so it is shinier as opposed to the lead. But if you guys can see the detail in this.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And it is only, there's my hand, so that gives you a sense of size. But yeah, Tom, essentially what happened was he was told by a guy in the industry, hey, take a look at this stuff and see if you can sculpt, something like it. And he bought the wrong stuff. This is another very old piece from 75, again, also from a Frazetta painting, or inspired by one, I think would be the most appropriate way to say it. Here are 2 barbarians that might look a little familiar.
Nice.
Little
Conan.
Yeah, it could be used as Conan.
Yeah, we don't say Conan. we Could be
But-
Thongor or somebody else, but
Non-Conan?
yeah.
But so back in 75, 76, maybe even 77, they actually, the guys running the company didn't realize there might be any kind of an intellectual property issue. And with the way the things were handled in the 70s, I'm not sure if there would have been. They were actually buying Frazetta posters from whoever was distributing them for them and taking them to shows. And at shows, they were selling Frazetta posters as an authorized distributor and the miniatures at the same table. So at least from their perspective, they thought, that they were pretty well covered. Apparently at some point in the 90s, they got a cease and desist and they just pulled the pieces. Here's another one. Another very early piece, but also a Frazetta inspired because I know John likes them.
Yeah, show Steve the barbarian with the girl, the Frazetta one on the skulls. That from the painting.
So this is a harder one to find. In around the same time, he tried to do some 54 millimeter figures, and they didn't sell very well because 54 millimeters almost never do. But yeah.
The face. And when they sculpt that, they sculpt them at that size, though, right? So it's not like.
Correct.
Sometimes, obviously with the comic page, it's bigger, and then it gets shrunken down. But when they're doing those little figures, the 25 and the 15 millimeter figures, they're sculpting them at that size.
Right. Now, later on at least in the 90s and 2000s, Games Workshop was producing their plastic figures. They were having sculptors do 3 times the size sculpts, what they called 3-ups, and they'd pantograph them down to size. But it's the process is pretty different. So here is, we'll see if this comes through. This is one of Tom's original sculpts. And within the industry, they're called greens because it turns out that's the color that the yellow and blue putty turns when it cures. Well, when it mixes. And let's see, this is probably from, it looks like 83. Yeah, well,
So that's the piece that the mold
Here's
is
my
made of,
thumb.
right?
Well, that's the original sculpt.
Yeah.
Oh,
This is what's generally referred to as the archive around here, which has the goal is to produce, to store one hard copy of each figure that was put into production.
Oh, wow.
So this was part of trying to write down the history of the company, is figure out what went into production where, because up until 87, they never produced a catalog that showed all the images. But I have this here. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a 2-part black rubber mold with castings in it. So this is actually a sample mold, as in when we did the first project to re-release figures, we wanted to send samples around to some magazines and other people to get them to review them and say good things about us to people, right? So we made a mold that just had one copy of each of the samples. And let's see. Yeah, light in here might not be great, but if you can see here, where is he? Is he coming through clear?
Oh, cool. Yeah.
The detail on there is just really fine.
Yeah, look at that chainmail.
Yep. And so what you would do is the 2 halves here, you would cook. These are soft at first before they've been vulcanized. So you'd put them in a big mold ring and you put your bottom down, you lay your sculpts in there like the greens that I showed you. And then you put your second half on and you're going to cook it for about an hour at 350 degrees and about 1,000 pounds of pressure, which builds up to around 3,000 before it's over. And then you pop it out and after it cools, you take the greens back out. Usually they're destroyed in the process, or at least damaged. So having old greens that are completely intact is pretty rare. I've got a bunch of damaged ones here, but there aren't many that's come out in one piece, especially back then. People have gotten better about it now. So then this would be, if these had been from an original, you would treat these as your masters. So you'd run off about 12 good copies, and then you'd redo the process to make a mold that has, say, just this guy in it. Well, yeah, and then this is, so this is the gaming room, which there's a bunch of junk on it, but that's about a 12-foot table. And then everything in these cases is product that we sell that has been painted by volunteers from around the world.
Wow,
we got a project where if somebody wants to paint something up for us, we will ship it out to them. They paint it, send it back, and then we send them a copy as a gift. Not really as compensation, but more just a sign of appreciation. And we then credit them when we use the images of these, like on the web store.
Is that the bone throne up above?
Yeah.
Look at this. Get close to that. The whole thing is all skeletons. I mean, that's a crazy.
Yeah. And Tom Meyer sculpted this piece, and I was talking to him about it, and it was inspired by, he had seen like a documentary on army ants and the way they would, form those shapes. So originally he had wanted to make it even bigger, but the other owners talked him into not going too overboard on it. But it is a nightmare to cast.
Mm.
Yeah, it's all. Then you got the big lug there, and I love that one. That one's a great one.
And you cast all of these? These are part of, what you're manufacturing?
Yes.
Wow.
I think right now I've got about 2,000 individual miniatures. That would be to say, like, this guy here would be one.
Yeah.
There's about 2,000 different ones in production at the moment. There's more that Iron Wind has in production. Well, I didn't even get into that, but yeah, basically I ran the project for Iron Wind for 5 years. They let me buy in as a partner. And after a while, like competing for resources and stuff, and I had picked up some rights to some more of the stuff that had gotten sold back to sculptors and things. They offered for me to branch off onto my own, and did that in 2020.
That's the one I just bought from you. Go back the idle height. Yeah.
Yep, this was painted by, I believe, a customer named Armando Santillano.
It's inspired by Ray Harryhausen, right?
Oh yeah. Well, and unfortunately, these usually things photograph pretty well here, but I think the nature of the camera phone, it's not. It might be a little dark being backlit.
What's cool is they're stealing stuff from this idol, and then the skeletons are coming up from under the ground. See, that's what I loved about these. They reminded me of those. Did you ever watch those? The Ray Harryhausen films?
Oh yeah, Voyage of Sinbad and the Golden Fleece.
That's what.
Oh yeah, you got to watch. Jason.
Look at this. I love this one. That's the Immortals one, right? The
cool.
Fight of the Immortals.
I think so, yeah. And then this is a nice one. Tom Meyer sculpted all these dioramas, and I know Tom wasn't into superhero comics as much, but he was definitely into, I know he liked the Judge Dredd stuff, and I think some of the fantasy type stuff. Tom is definitely a reader, so I'd say he probably would have been more into the original novels than the comics as to like Conan. Mm-hmm. But he definitely was aware of all that stuff.
Wow, that's incredible.
But yeah, it's good.
And there's a lot, I think, probably closing in on 300 painters have volunteered with this project.
Yeah, and there's people that charge too. Like I saw, like there's like you got a lot of painters that they charge people like they'll paint their miniatures for them. They have like a they do like a business that way. Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, we in general, I haven't really paid anybody to paint any of these, because once we decided we were going to try and do it through volunteers, which was mainly came out because back when I was actively gaming more and meeting up with the friends at the local hobby store, we would have loved the option to do some of this.
Let me see that blimp one. Go closer to that blimp one. I just find that one. Look at that's freaking nuts.
Yep. So, have you guys heard of Warhammer?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So, the major game at the hobby store was Warhammer. That's what everybody was playing. That was fantasy based. And every time they'd come out with a new edition, there'd always be rumors that would creep up that they were going to do a blimp for the dwarves. And they never produced a damn blimp. So once it became clear that this project I was working on was going to last, it was really the project is referred to as the Chaos Wars project, because that was the name of a rule set that the company produced in 1987. Yeah. And it was supposed to just be a gimmick to get a little bit of attention, but ended up taking it around to conventions that year, and enough people liked it and responded well that we realized, rather than move me on to other new projects, I was just told to keep going with it. So when we did the second set of releases, we made sure to work a blimp into it, because my friends and I had been waiting for like 15 years for that to happen. So we eventually just made our own. And a guy here in Central Ohio had designed it, and we reworked it for mass production.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this is a crazy art form, and it's very underappreciated, like incredibly underappreciated. If you think of look at that stuff, just the talent that you have to and the patience to do that stuff. Gosh.
Well, for a lot of people that are into it, it is somewhat therapeutic.
Yeah.
I find it to be a stress reliever.
Yeah. Henry Cavill is huge into this stuff too. The wargaming. Yeah. Go ahead now. You were going to say something?
I was going to say, so you're casting like pieces that were done, decades ago and recasting them. But are you creating all new pieces as well?
So, yes. There are, so like these little guys here, these chameleon type guys. Mm-hmm. A sculptor in England did those for another company that a friend of mine owns. And he really wasn't getting any sales in the US. So he asked either he asked or I asked. One of us brought up me licensing them from him. So they were probably sculpted 3 or 4 years ago. And, when I sell some of them, I cut a royalty check over to the guy who first commissioned them.
Okay.
But that's not all of it. So there's like, here, this is a troglodyte shaman. Can you see him okay?
Yep.
Yeah. So
he is a magic user to go with all these troglodytes. Tom Meyer sculpted all these troglodytes back in like 1984, 85. And then I think in 2019, I mentioned to him that, people would like a magic user to go with them. So Tom sculpted this one in 2019.
If you don't mind me asking, what is the going rate of something like a Tom to, I know he's the cream of the crop, but what is the going rate for a person to sculpt one of this? What do they charge?
Well, what I would call the professionals, how do I want to put this? The people who are really known, the really good ones would charge at least, I'd say, $500 to $600 for this guy.
I would I would love to make Steve as a baby Thanos. I'd make a big.
But then, cavalry can be double or more. Something like, like one of these dinosaurs could be a couple $1,000s these days.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So commissioning new sculpts is not cheap. Now, Tom cut me a deal on this guy, which I really appreciate. Tom's done a couple new pieces for me. Bob Charette is another guy. He was a Ral Partha sculptor. Did a lot of really nice stuff, especially in the 80s. And he sculpted a handful of pieces for me a year or so ago. So these are gnolls. These are rabbit men. And down here are what were sold as ratlings. They're rat men. And so this guy here, who's painted up a little bit like Splinter, Bob sculpted that for me just a couple years ago. And actually, there's another painted copy of him and another sculpt that Bob did recently. Bob sculpted these big rat guys. I don't even have those in production yet.
Wow.
But
Those are all
so I've probably gotten 30 or so new sculpts over the last couple years put into production. Well, that I've commissioned, and then I also produced Tom Meyer's signature line that he had started up as his own company. He ran it from like 88 to 2017, and then shut it down because he basically didn't want to do all the production work. And he ended up licensing the rights to produce that stuff to me. And it is this stuff. So these are incredibly detailed. My phone's probably not going to do a good job of them. But this is Tom Meyer's Thunderbolt Mountain Ranges. And these here, pardon the backlighting, are some of the newer releases that we did. We ran a Kickstarter to put, I think, 30 or 40 of his new sculpts out. Mm-hmm. And, I don't have the money. I couldn't afford to pay, $500 a piece to get those done.
Jeez.
But the Kickstarter, covered production costs and was able to pay Tom a royalty, and they're selling okay now. Here's actually another collection of old original greens. These are some of the very few that actually weren't completely destroyed when they came out of the molds.
Yeah, I got that one. That's the Frankenstein, the flesh golem, the golem
Yep.
one. Yeah,
and then the werewolf that goes with him here.
Yeah, it was a flesh golem, wasn't Frankenstein, a flesh golem.
Yeah.
All right, so in wrapping up, now what do you any last words for Jacob? And we'll put up.
Just what's the we're gonna have the information below for everyone. We'll have the links for everything, but tell us a bit. The name of the company. If you want to shout out the website now, or if there's a store they can actually go to, stuff of that nature.
So the company's name is Ral Partha Legacy. Thought it was important to use the Ral Partha name, but still differentiate that I'm not trying to claim I'm the original guys. I'm just trying to keep it moving until somebody else takes it over after I do. And the website's ralparthalegacy.com. We're trying to re-release more stuff whenever we get the money. Molds and metal aren't cheap. So, maybe when we sell a figure, we make $1 profit in the end. And, every $50 or $60, I can then afford a new mold and, just keeps it moving. Trying to grow the community too. We've had, like I said, I think 300-ish painters from around the world.
What I wanted to show, one of my favorite, I have one of my favorites is, Niall, can you go to this? I want to show Steve this right here. This is the Ral Partha. Let me just get it bigger. But that's the Ral Partha, the Steve Reeves Hercules. I love that one. Look at that, Steve. You know Steve Reeves?
Of course.
Yeah.
Come on now.
Look at that. That's one of my favorites that I have. I got about 5 of those and all that stuff. Those are from the imports and all that stuff.
And the same sculptor, I think, did a not Xena and a not Hercules. Was it Hercules? What was Kevin Sorbo?
Yeah, Hercules.
Okay, yeah.
Adjacent. Come on.
Yes.
He wasn't Hercules. Get out of here. Sorbo gets pathetic. All right. So, Steve, any last words to Mr.
Again,
Jacob?
It's very commendable, and also in an era where it seems impossible to get people out of their smartphone or off their computer or off their gaming system. It's very nice to see. And in a way, it brings me back because I also used to visit the hobby stores back in England in my time. Of course, back then we had, a lot of people who were into their trains. A lot of people were into their armies. And I was particularly involved in the Napoleonic Wars. I had the complete French and English armies.
You did, Steve?
Yeah, I even had the Prussians.
What scale? 15?
I love the
15
Napoleon.
millimeter would be like the half an inch high ones.
Yeah, half an inch high.
Yeah, that's most Napoleonic guys because you need a shitload of troops.
Yes, you do.
15,
And it was really funny, to build the squares. Anyway, we're getting too crazy now.
Wow.
So, there's a part of me that I was there, and the smell and the atmosphere of a hobby store is, I don't know how to explain it. It's just, you go in there, and the person who used to run our store, I swear, was alive when Wellington was alive. Actually came out, and he would come out and he'd go, his hands were shaking. And I was like, oh my God, he's 400 years old, this guy. And there was nothing he didn't know. But like, yeah, this small screw fits into this train that was made only once in 1922. Unbelievable. So in a way, you brought back some nice memories for me, and it's definitely been, as John Cimino did say earlier on, I was fully educated. I am now armed with all this information. I had no idea this world was out there. So thank you for coming by, Jacob. I really appreciate it.
Well,
Yeah, Steve, it's wonderful to know that you had a little part in there. That's awesome. I love, it makes me, this is something new. I like that. And Jacob, once again, thank you for showing up. Thank you for keeping the spirit alive. I'm going to show up one day at your pad and we'll go through all that stuff too. I'd like to see all that stuff close up because you say you don't know what to do with it after. I mean, that's almost like a museum you have there too.
Well,
and I think that it could be publicly.
Well, there are some plans for that. I don't know what course it's going to take. I'm actually talking to some lawyers about turning the company into a nonprofit organization. I'll chat with you about that sometime if you want to, but it's all still in the early stages. Basically just finding new ways to lose money.
Right. But
Cimino isn't an expert at that, but a lot of us people are experts at losing money like that.
Yeah. When I first got involved with the miniatures industry, every old man that I had met who had anything to do with the miniatures industry told me the same bad joke, which is, how do you get a miniatures company that's worth $1 million? You start with one that's worth $2 million. And as bad as the joke is, they were so right.
Yeah. But that's why you did.
That's why I got to
Well, thanks, Jacob. Thanks for showing us that. I mean, it's awesome. And, like I said, this is a little niche market in here, and I think it still pertains to the comic books and all that stuff. It's stuff that we love and we can appreciate. All right, Steve, get us out of here. Mighty Mystic Milner, brother.
Boom.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us on Pop XP. If you haven't already, make sure to click that subscribe button and also click the bell for notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome new content. Also, don't forget to head on over to Twitter and follow us at the Pop XP and over on Instagram at the Pop XP. Thanks again everyone, and we'll see you soon.